Oliver is a professor at the University of Tübingen, and his talk shows how important the discussion about safety data transfer is, because this is based on setting up a data structure for the German Human Genome-Phenome archive. So he's head of applied bioinformatics at the University of Tübingen. Please go ahead, and we are interested in your talk.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity to give you an overview of a project that has just started, the German Human Genome-Phenome Archive, or GHGA. I know the abbreviation is a mouthful. I'm representing a whole consortium of researchers that have recently, in October, started to set up such a national infrastructure. I would like to start with giving some sort of motivation, and I'm of course preaching to the choir here. We see a flood of data that's coming in particular in two areas. Cancer, which is, as you know, responsible for about 20% of the deaths in Germany. And here we have, over the last decade or two, really uncovered not just the disease mechanisms that are driving this, but we have brought that pretty close to therapy. It has become a standard mode of therapy to look at omics evidence. And what we see is that all the cancers are distinct. We rarely see the same somatic variants twice. So data sharing is essential. And if we don't pool this data together, we will not be able to help the patients. And similarly, similar arguments can be made for rare diseases, as you know, are not rare as one would think. And we've just heard how you can leverage this data, but again, it is essential that we bring that together. And we expect, and this is taken from a paper from you and Bernie already a while ago, we expect that the amount of genomes that become available really take off. We expect an exponential growth here, and one can debate that, but I think we all agree that this growth is there. One can debate how quickly it grows, how meaningful this growth is. But the fact remains that we are dealing with millions of genomes, but we are not effectively sharing them, probably to the disadvantage of our patients. So we perceive data sharing as a sort of bridge, trying to bring together research on one hand and clinical care on the other. So what we are mostly talking about when we're discussing this German Human Genome-Phenome Archive is that we want to enable secondary use of clinical omics data in research. So we want to make biological discovery on the data that is generated in the clinic. And once we have made this discovery, we want to translate that back into clinical care. I think this is a pretty straightforward idea, and everyone has been working on that for quite a while. And I want to point out some of the more technical issues related to that, and how we can democratize the data that is currently not shared to the degree that could be possible. When we're talking about omics data, then I think it is currently mostly genomes or exomes that are available, but there is, of course, a certain interest as well in other omics modalities, epigenomes, transcriptomes, proteomes. And as you know, we are getting more and more interested also in single cell versus bulk analysis of omics data with all the complexity that brings. So no matter which way you go, whether you look at the complexity of one data modality or at the tricky problem of bringing all these different omics layers together, What is challenging is not just the complexity of these data, but by now also the volume. It is simply not that trivial to manage a petabyte or 10 petabyte of data. And there's also this question that has been raised just earlier as well, the question of protecting that data. The data is highly sensitive. You don't want your genome data to float outside in the internet somewhere. And the infrastructure that is required to really securely, safely store this data, that is on a level that is not easily achieved by the individual lab that actually does the sequencing. We want to bring this infrastructure that provides, that helps solving these challenges to, of course, the clinical and research community. And in cancer, that's a very large community that has pioneered data sharing in genomic medicine for a while. And in rare diseases, I think the value of sharing is much more established and evident just from the fact that these diseases are rare. In a perspective, however, we would also like to leverage that as the number of available data set grows for common diseases, for example, cardiology, or when you think about the national cohort. So looking at data sharing, there were a few milestones, and you can see that there are a few international projects, probably at the starting point. One of the most important projects that got this off the ground was the 1,000 Genomes project, but I think most people are familiar also with IGCC, TCGA, but more recently also EXAC, and the Human Cell Atlas and PCOV that have brought all these things forward and that have generated lots of attention and also high impact publications. But there's one important but when you look at these projects and also German contributions to that. Germany currently lacks an infrastructure for archiving and sharing genomics data on the national level. We have been using other infrastructures like the European Genome-Phenome archive, but there are certain German idiosyncrasies when it comes to legal basis for sharing data that make it harder for us than for others to use these infrastructures. And this has been realized also on the European level. Those of you who are familiar with the European Genome-Phenome Archive, EGA, you might be aware that EGA is transitioning from a centralized model where all the data was sitting in Hingston, basically at the EBI and a copy in Spain, to a federated model where there are local EGA nodes that are, but don't have to be, national nodes where the data is held, and only the metadata that is required to make the data findable is then propagated to EGA. The implication of that is, of course, that we need some sort of national infrastructure, that we have to have international standards and data exchange mechanisms that are compliant with the overarching regulatory frameworks like the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation within the EU, but also the national legislation. Now enters another initiative, and that is NFDI. Some of you might have heard from that's based on recommendations primarily from the Rat the Council for Research Information Infrastructure, RFII in Germany. DFG has set up a funding program for national research data infrastructure that's called NFDI. And this has started funding projects this year. There was a competitive call, a first call, where 9 consortia from all areas of science, so this is physics, as well as humanities, as well as medicine. And one of these consortia is the German Human Genome-Phenome Archive, GHGA. So we started receiving funding in October to actually set up such a national infrastructure for managing human-related omics data. So the core mission of GHGA is to establish this national infrastructure, not limited to genomics, but of course the majority of the data is in genomics, so this is what we will start with. And this platform should permit the fair data archival, and fair, for those of you who are not familiar with that, relates to making the data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And that's a paradigm in open science that has been around for a couple of years now. In order to do that, we would like to connect to the major omics centers, the centers that are generating the data. And GHGA would then provide controlled access management. So basically take over the role of managing who gains access to the data, protecting the data. And one key component in that would also be a joint ethical, legal, and data use framework that protects the data and describes what can be done with the data, what cannot be done. And that is also has been checked by lawyers, that is reliable also for those people who deposit the data, because you don't want to get into trouble by sharing the data. And I think that has been one of the major hurdles when it comes to data sharing. This would be a distributed platform, so the data would not reside in one place. There are various reasons that I can go into in the discussion if that is interesting. But with the goal to democratize data processing and research use. Everyone should have, in principle, access to this data if they are a bona fide researcher and have a good reason to look at the data. And ideally, this would strengthen Germany's role in international genome initiatives. So what we built in GHGA is a complex distributed infrastructure. It's basically logically, it's a unity, but it is actually distributed at various centers. I try to illustrate these by this network of nodes. I illustrate this technical infrastructure in a bit. There will be portals, web-based portals for disease-related communities that would give the researchers access to reference data sets, easier ways to find the data. Of course, we're working closely with people in AI, for example, ALICE, the European Lab for Learning Intelligent Systems, in order to bring AI methods to the data. We are collaborating with initiatives like the COVID-19 data portal, and of course, through this federation with the European Genome-Phenome archive. We would like to capture as much of the data of the large NGS centers in Germany, and that requires that we have technical standards, harmonization, but also ethical legal standards that allow us to have a very strict and transparent governance process that connects the data sets to so-called UACs, the use and access committees, basically the people who decide who can use the data. I now give you an idea of how this network looks like. So this is building upon existing initiatives, leveraging these initiatives. So we have some of the leading institutions in genomic medicine on board. We have 6 high-performance computing centers that are committed to provide the infrastructure, because this NFDI program does not finance the iron. It does not finance any computers. It just funds the staff for it. And you can see that there is a bunch of sites in Germany that are contributing. Some of these provide compute power. That's, for example, there's Tübingen, there's Heidelberg, that are involved, but also Munich, 6 hubs. And some of these hubs also provide, that's indicated by this cloud symbol here, provide compute power, so you can bring the algorithms to the data and have no longer to download or copy the data to your local infrastructure. Some of these centers are also involved in the DFG-funded NGS competence network. That is where major academic sequencing centers are. We are also involved in the German Network for Bioinformatics Infrastructure, DENBI. The highlighted sites here are DENBI nodes, and that way we can, for example, provide the full compute power of the DENBI cloud infrastructure to these researchers. When we talk about these communities, then it is clear that rare disease and cancer are sort of the poster boys of leveraging genomic data sharing, but we intend to roll that out. We just have to start somewhere. The funding is limited in a certain way, and we cannot do everything in parallel. So we start with these two communities, rare disease and cancer. We expect that we know that there is quite some synergy already between these communities, for example, when it comes to data processing. And then when we roll this out to other communities, we will also roll this out to other omics modalities, going from genome to transcriptome to proteome and so on. And we expect this whole thing to grow, and there are different types of community users. We started by getting several major scientific societies on board that support this approach. We want to start with these initial seed communities and primarily, initially at least, address bioinformaticians and data scientists, clinical researchers, and we hope that through this translation, this then ends up with the treating physicians and ultimately, of course, with the patients. And as we evolve as an infrastructure, we will roll this out to other communities, and there's a team involved in GHGA that is trying to push this to other communities, basically doing community development for this purpose. So what are the key things that we will provide? Well, if you look at the key hurdles for data sharing, then probably the most important point is uncertainty. People are not sure whether it's lawful, whether it's permitted to deposit the data and give others access to that, and that is something we're working on to have this joint ethical legal framework. There's a whole team working on defining the groundworks for that. Then we often hear that data deposition is complicated and labor intensive. We have a few solutions to that. One would be that if you use one of these major omics centers, we try to achieve basically a push button deposition where you say, yes, I want to deposit the data, and the direct transfer of the metadata would then enable that. You would have to check that and see whether you have all the permissions, and then you can just forward it, and it would immediately become visible also in EGA. We also hear on the other side that it's complicated to gain access to the data once it has been deposited at EGA, for example. So we're developing dedicated graphical user interfaces, but probably more importantly, also dedicated support staff. So if you want to deposit the data, and that's actually something you can do now already, you can contact us and we will help you to make this more easy, more streamlined. Another frequent complaint is that the data archives like EGA are just archives, just data dumps, and finding the data, accessing the data in a community-specific, user-friendly manner is not possible. And that is why we will build over the coming years community portals that have reference data sets, for example, for cancer, that are developed jointly with the communities to browse this data and identify it. Now, it's not so easy to build such an infrastructure. And one of the obvious reasons is that there are different types of users. Patients, physicians, researchers, but also bioinformaticians, and they have different degrees of technical proficiency. And that means they also need different means to access the data. For most physicians, web-based UIs will probably be the way to go. If you have a large research group that is often working with genomics data, then data download might be the way to go. But if you really want to do large-scale analyses, then you need to use distributed or cloud computing, and all of these modes of access need to be supported by such an archive. So GHGA is actually a pretty complex infrastructure that is building on these 6 data and compute hubs that is being fed data by on one hand, the existing sequencing facilities, for example, the GFG network of NGS competence centers. But of course, everyone else can deposit data as well. So this is not a closed shop. It's an open national infrastructure that is being built. And within this infrastructure, we have various components. We have raw data archival. So we're doing the same thing that you can get from EGA as well. You can deposit your data and your metadata. We make it findable. We can give you access to cloud resources to analyze the data. We are developing infrastructure like dedicated bioinformatics tools and LC and privacy security frameworks. On top of that, we have portals. These are web-based portals through which you can access the data, look at the data with a community-specific view, and through the cloud portal, you can gain access to these compute resources that are down here. We're trying to connect that to other NFDI initiatives, but also to research communities. And as you can imagine, this is going to take a while. So we are now hiring staff. We're setting this up. It's going to take a while until this is all flying. What is it that we actually do on the archival side? That's perhaps easiest to explain. So the idea is that once a researcher actually has generated omics data, this data needs to be deposited, and that can happen either through an omics center. So if you have a large-scale sequencing center, we will basically have fast-track ways for data deposition. They would just forward this data to one of the data hubs. The data hub itself would store the omics data, let's say FASTQ files, BAM files. And the metadata that describes what this is, describes that this is a melanoma data set that has 50 patients who are sequenced to depth X with a certain technology. This metadata that makes the data findable and usable, that is being forwarded to the central GHGA hub. And from there, it's also forwarded to EGA. So everything that you deposit at GHGA will become immediately visible, findable in EGA as well. But the researcher can then check whether the data should already be deposited, can make it visible once, for example, a publication is out, and will also retain full control over who sees the data. So by depositing data there, it does not become immediately visible to everyone. It becomes visible to everyone, but not accessible to everyone. So the user still retains the right to determine who can access the data. There's a complex governance structure behind that. Those of you who have used EGA are probably familiar with these data access committee mechanisms. So we are, of course, networking with existing initiatives to a large degree. So we are talking with the communities, the cancer, the rare disease communities, and probably many people in the audience have been involved in that when it comes to access control for the data, when it comes to data archival, distributed analytics, and the LC part of that. But we're also talking to other consortia and NFDI. NFDI is a network of consortia, and we are trying to standardize data formats, data processing, but also strategic developments and technical developments with those. One of the more recent developments, and I think you heard about that yesterday from Joachim, is DECOY, the German COVID-19 omics initiative, which is a national network for omics data generation and analysis in Germany. And within DECOY, GHGA has been tasked with assembling German COVID-19 data and share them in the European context. There is, as some of you might know, a COVID-19 data portal. So while, as I said, GHGA is still being established, we already offer support for data management deposition in the context of COVID-19. So contact us if you're interested. That is a sort of a service we're offering right now in order to make more data accessible in this ongoing pandemic. Where are we heading? Well, I think it has been mentioned already that the 1 million plus human European genomes initiative is ongoing, and of course we're involved in the discussions around Genome-DE. We envision GHGA to be part of the infrastructure supporting Genome-DE, and as the German federated EGA node, of course, we would enable the data sharing within Europe that is required to make this 1 million European Genomes initiative fly. I'd like to close here, summarize a bit. I hope I could show you our vision. That's what it currently is, that data infrastructures and GHGA in particular are sort of bridging many different concerns. We try to bring omics data to researchers. We hope to get back methods and innovations that can be leveraged on such an infrastructure. We hope that this will actually lead to improved treatments, improved diagnosis, and we expect that the routine healthcare data will form the majority of the data in GHGA. And of course, we are also interested in collaborating with industry when it comes to medical products and leveraging this omics data in this area as well. In order to build that, we need these data infrastructure at the center, which can be physically distributed across multiple sites, but should be logically connected so that users do not perceive this as the data sitting here and there, but as one unified resource that they can use for their research for patient treatment. With that, I would like to conclude. I would like to thank my colleagues. I'm just representing the whole consortium here, which is led by Oliver Kohlbacher in Heidelberg. And you see the names of the key players here. And with that, I would like to conclude, and I'd be happy to take your questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's really great to see that we have such coordinations going on. We all know that we have already a wealth of data around, which are going to be collected and be available now in the right context to the right people. One question I do have is the encryption of the data done in some way? Is it done via software, or do you think also about encryption using hardware interfaces like that is done in the data transport from physicians to the healthcare systems, as we have heard before?
Both of that is being implemented. So the data hubs actually have hardware encryption for the long-term archival, but we also use software encryption. It's complex because it depends in this data lifecycle. It depends on where you are. The bioinformatics tools simply need unencrypted data to process. Yeah, so you have to decrypt the data somewhere. And what we ensure is that data is encrypted at rest. So when it's just sitting there on disk, either software or hardware. And we ensure that the transfer the data is always encrypted during transfer. So if you want to process the data in a project, then it is actually sitting on hardware encrypted systems, because then we can decrypt on the fly and the encryption becomes invisible, transparent to the bioinformatics tools which need access to the unencrypted data.
Okay. If you put that on a scale from 1 to 100, and 1 is just started this achievements, and 100 is fully functional, where do we stand?
20%. I think we've started, perhaps even 30. It depends on how you define the 100%, really. I think we will have an operational infrastructure in 2021. What we will not have is these community-specific data portals. That is something that is on a longer time scale. DFG decided to cut the funding of all the NFDI projects by between 20 and 30%. So that means we have to delay some of the agenda items that we had. I think a full operation in the way that I sketched it here, including the portals, will certainly take 3 years. But at the same time, we are accepting, or we are supporting submissions right now. So parts of this infrastructure are operational. Other parts will certainly take a year to a year and a half until they are up and running.
Yeah, exciting project. Thank you very much again for the presentation. And
thank you for having me.
With our common interest, we wish you very good luck to achieve all the goals, and we'll see what happens during the next years. So